I'd like to welcome to our show Catherine Coghlin, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, the national voice of all primary steel producers, representing 17 members that produce 100% of Canada's steel production, as well as some of the largest users of Canadian steel. Catherine has been with the CPSA since 2019 and previously had been an executive vice president with the Forest Products Association of Canada. Catherine has been named one of the top 100 lobbyists by the Hill Times newspaper for the past 4 years. I want to welcome to the show, Catherine. Thank you for being here with us.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
No, and obviously a lot of news coming out. We just talked before we came on air here about the changes just yesterday. We were talking that some positive change, so that's a good thing. And we'll get into that a little later in our conversation. But I thought we'd start off putting some perspective on some numbers, some of the numbers so that the viewers and listeners can get a sense of how much steel we do produce and send to the United States and elsewhere. So I guess my first question would be, how much steel do we export to the U.S. or did we export to the U.S. before tariffs were implemented? What percentage of the steel we produce goes to the U.S.?
Yes, about 1/2 of what we produce. So that would be about 6 to 6.5 million tons of steel on an annual basis went to the United States market obviously before the U.S. president applied tariffs on our industry.
And what would that make up on the U.S. side? So out of the steel that they bring into their country, do you know what percentage we would make up here in Canada?
Yeah, it's a little over 20% of their imports. So the interesting part of the Canada-US steel story is that the United States is about 26 million tons short of steel. In other words, they don't produce 26 million tons and do need to rely on imports. Canada is the largest steel importer into their country. And as I said, that was about 6 million tons of that 26 million, which is a little over 20%.
So I guess my question, or next question, maybe it's an obvious question: how can the U.S. survive these price increases? Obviously, 20% is a big number. What does that mean to U.S. businesses, to end users? I know that since the tariffs have been put on, steel coming into the U.S., even domestic steel prices and production, their prices have gone up quite a bit as well. You're hearing stories of the U.S. And producers actually bringing in from other places in the world, because even if you factor in the tariffs, it's still cheaper paying a 50% tariff than some of the prices that what we've seen in the U.S. So how is it that the president can believe that the U.S. can survive such a higher cost, even coupled with copper prices, 50% tariffs, aluminum, 50% tariffs? Can you give us an indication of what they're telling you? How can they actually get by?
Well, listen, I think that there is no doubt that the tariff regime that the U.S. president has placed on steel globally is increasing prices. So first fact is that steel, since the introduction of the 232 tariffs on steel, even the beginning one in March at 25%, we have seen a 40% rise in hot rolled coal prices, which we use as a proxy for steel prices, as of course, there's many steel prices, but a 40% rise is definitely significant. I do, appreciate that the Trump administration is very, tied to their tariff regime. But I will say that the questions you're asking are real, are pragmatic. I mean, we do have a deficit of steel that the U.S. requires imports to supply, and we are seeing these rising prices. So obviously, in the case of the Canadian industry, even with that price rise at 50% tariff, it's no longer a viable market for us. For other importers into the United States, however, they are often unfair traders that dump into that market. They will have the ability to continue to dump at 50% tariff. So that's the conundrum, is that the tariffs are actually impacting the fair trading partners more than the unfair trading partners, so to speak.
Yeah, it's I guess a lot of dumping we've been hearing, obviously countries like China dumping steel into North America in general, I guess for many years. I want to go back to Canadian production, and you mentioned 50% goes to the US. I guess the obvious question again is, where does the other 50% go? And is it all consumed domestically? Do we send steel to other countries? And I guess the next question is, can we increase that? Can we send more to other countries?
Yeah, so 50% of our production heads to the United States. The other 50% resides in Canada, pretty much. I mean, there's a small percentage, I think less than 0.1% goes to Europe, for example. So we are not, we really only serve two markets, the Canada and the United States. So clearly that's one of the challenges we have now with the 50% tariff is we've lost market for half of our production. So that is what's been creating the devastating impact in the industry, because we can't, to anticipate the question, we can't pivot to other markets, unfortunately, maybe in small niche areas, but on the big commodity steel products, there is a global oversupply, predominantly out of China, as you've mentioned. So when you have such a glut of steel in the marketplace, building new markets becomes extremely difficult.
So, I know in every business, I talk to a lot of small businesses, my own business as well. Whenever you rely heavily on one customer, where all your eggs are kind of in one basket, obviously that can be at a certain point in time a recipe for disaster, which I guess we're seeing now. We thought our brothers to the south would always be, I guess, there buying steel, buying copper, buying aluminum, buying our products. I guess the country as a whole sending about 70% of what we take out of the ground and build to the US. Do you think we've just been a little complacent, not trying to do more, not trying to send our steel elsewhere? You mentioned there's a glut in the world, but is it just we just relied on the US for too long and too much?
Well, structurally, we created an integrated economy with the United States. And so we can't forget that. And we have been under free trade agreement with the CUSMA partners. It's now USMCA or, partners, but of course there's NAFTA before that, what have you. So we've had decades of integration. And certainly on behalf of the steel industry, I can say that North American partnership has created significant benefit to Canadian and US steel industries alike. So it was a natural partnership facilitated by the free trade agreements between our countries. So that's what we're unraveling here is decades and decades of integration. So, I don't call it complacency. I call it it was a win-win scenario for both countries. Clearly, that is not the direction the US wants to maintain. They want to go it alone and, unravel those strong trading relationships. So then it requires us to pivot and change our approach. But, in this, I understand theoretically the point you're making, but for us, it really became a position of strength to operate as a North American sector. We got a lot of benefit from that. Now we're standing on our own.
Standing our own, yeah, and I know obviously the Prime Minister just yesterday made some great announcements on our own tariffs on countries bringing steel into Canada. But it kind of makes me wonder, what can we do to help our situation? Obviously, I know the Prime Minister has also said that there will be some form of tariff that he believes there'll be some form of tariffs on Canada, between Canada and the US, even after negotiations are complete. So based on what you're saying, that the 50% stays domestically, 50% goes to the US, perhaps pro-growth strategies from our government trying to do whatever they can do to create more growth in our country. Would that be the way, I guess, I don't want to say out of this situation, because I think it's going to take a while to do that, but pro-growth, perhaps lower taxes, perhaps do certain things to allow businesses to do more, to grow more, allow for bigger projects that require steel, require aluminum and copper and things like that. Would that be a suggestion that someone has made to the Prime Minister to help us get out of, or at least work our way out of this situation?
I mean, I think we see that as the vision of the Prime Minister. In fact, he's talked about nation building. He's talked about not in that nation building, prioritizing domestic supply chains, including steel. So I think all of that is in play, frankly. And yesterday we saw some steps forward for the procurement of steel, domestic steel and domestic projects and that kind of thing. But to your point, it's all about timing. And I think we all know, for those of us that have been in the, exposed to resource sector projects in our careers, we know it takes a long time. And I'm personally admiring, the notion of trying to do these things faster. We got a lot of, navigation to do. It's really important to consult and that sort of thing. But so that's the issue. I think the vision is there, but it's how do you get from where we are today to the vision? And that's where those measures came into play for us. I described it yesterday as we were bleeding out on the table. And so the supports and the border measures create immediate and impactful support. It doesn't by any stretch of the imagination, by the way, offset the 6 million tons that we've lost. In the best case scenario, we might get another we might get 2 million of new opportunity in our country, but nonetheless, that's 2 million we welcome, because that was 2 million we didn't have 2 days ago, right? So all that to say, the longer term vision of nation building using domestic supply chains and domestically created materials and supporting domestic jobs is what I think I'm hearing the Canadian government articulate at this moment in time.
Yeah, and as you said, any bit helps at this point when we're kind of fighting a bit of an uphill battle. So now that we have the 50% tariffs obviously in place, what does that mean for the steel industry here? Do you anticipate a lot of layoffs, more layoffs than we've already seen? What are you envisioning going forward?
Yeah, and I think I think the basis of the government's decision making has been just how negatively impacted the steel sector has been in Canada to Donald Trump's 50% tariffs. We have seen, since between March and May at 25%, we saw significant job losses and production curtailment. And in fact, we just got the May figures where we showed a 30% decline in production of steel nationwide. That's at a 25% tariff. But since June, we've been operating under a 50% tariff. So you can imagine, we don't have the public and official data sources of this yet because the data lags, but we can see our order books. They look like a war zone. There is not much there. So it was really desperation for us, and we are in desperate times, and we are still desperate, but we are more hopeful today than after the announcement yesterday of the new border measures.
I guess I want to end off with kind of a general question where we kind of started our interview, and that is, what impacts would the tariffs mean outside the steel industry? For those that are watching this show today and listening on the radio, what does it mean for outside the industry? Because I'm assuming there's a lot of people now saying, well, I don't work in the steel industry, this won't impact me. How does this impact Canadians, Ontarians? How does it impact all of us?
Yeah, well, certainly several things to say there. One is that the industry is a strategic industry for the country, in the sense that we play a really critical role to supporting the auto sector, the energy sector, the construction sector, the defense sector. I mean, if you're listening and you work in any sector that requires steel in any form, we are a strategic partner in your job, frankly. So there is definitely that. I will say that we know that Canadians might also be worried about supply chain disruption if we're suddenly taking on foreign entities that have been practicing unfair trade. My call to Canadians on this at this moment in time, though, is yes, there might be slightly higher prices, maybe not in the length of the project, by the way, but in the short term, in the immediate term. But the facts of that unfair trade are that they don't follow the rule of law. They have very, very poor labor practices. They have maybe no environmental standards, or if they do have standards, they're very poor. And in the Canadian context, we have, you know, really, really good wages, really good, you know, environmental track records, et cetera. So we have to make some choices. Is it all just going to be price, or are we going to have the bigger picture about our country in mind as we make our steel purchases?
Yeah, a lot of valid points. Steel touches many industries. You mentioned just a few: automotive, defense, two that come to mind for sure. So, Catherine Coughlin, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, CPSA. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I know you're a busy lady these days. I'm sure you'll continue to fight on our behalf and see what we can do. And hopefully the Prime Minister will be able to come up with a deal that can help all of us. So once again, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, bye-bye.